I'm not sure if anyone else was having issues getting in, but hopefully they'll figure it out. Let's get started. I'll share the source sheet.
Basically, you're into being recorded.
Okay, so tonight we are going to look at an interesting halachic topic with basis in this week's parsha. The parsha is Shelach, which is the story of the spies. Right, the spies go to Israel. They come back with a seemingly negative report. Although everyone struggles to understand what exactly was their sin, what did they do wrong, what should they have done differently, there's a lot to say about it. But the Gemara finds a very interesting connection to a pretty central halachic issue. And the issue is, what is the source that we have for a minyan?
Oh boy! No.
Okay, so this is a halachic topic that has gotten much airtime in recent years with discussion of why or can or should not women be included in a minyan. That is a really important, interesting discussion we're not going to really touch on tonight. There's been discussion about the age limit of a minyan as well. That's very interesting. Much more contemporary and equally as relevant, also not for tonight, is the question of transgender individuals and inclusion in a minyan.
Yeah, exactly.
And so minyan is a very central issue, and there's a lot of minyan topics to be discussed. But fundamentally, our question tonight is the source of a minyan being 10. Where do we get that from? And what we'll see some interesting
That's great.
discussion and application. So the source, we'll start with a Mishnah in Gemara in Masechet Megillah. The Mishnah tells us, and I'll try to make sure we're looking at the correct spot in the English translation as well. Ein porsin al shema, ve'in ovin lifnei hateva, ve'in osin al kapein, ve'in koin b'torah, ve'in maftirin b'navi, ve'in osin ma'amad u'moshav, ve'in omin birkat avelim, v'tanchumei avelim, birkat chatani, ve'in mizamnin, v'shem pachot me'asara. So it gives this whole list of things that we would call dvarim shepikdusha, which I translate as matters of holiness. I don't know how to translate it exactly, but a davar shepikdusha is something that requires a minyan to say it, right? So Kaddish, Kedusha, Torah reading, Birkat Kohanim, right? We can think of all sorts of things that require a minyan to perform them. So the Mishnah tells us that any of things that requires a minyan, that minyan is defined as 10. And again, bracketing all the other important, interesting halachic conversations, we'll take as a given that means 10 adult men. The Gemara says, Minah hanemile. How do we know this? What's the source for this? Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, to Amar Kra, v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. So he says the source is a pasuk in Sefer Vayikra from Parshat Emor, where God says, v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. You have this in source number 2, the full context of this verse. I will be sanctified among the children of Israel. Uchtiv hatam, and it says elsewhere in the Torah, in next week's parsha, Parshat Korach, hibadlu mitoch ha'eda. It says, separate from this congregation, or this gathering, or this assembly. And so there's what's called the Gzeira Shava. The same word is used in both verses. Nidashti bitoch b'nei Yisrael, bitoch, among, and hibadlu mitoch, separate from this congregation. So toch. We have the same word, toch, used in both scenarios. Okay, what does that have to do with 10? Nidashti bitoch, right? Where do we get 10 from that? So we need a second Gzeira Shava. We need a second same word being used in two different contexts. So in the story of Korach, it says, Hibadlu mitoch ha'eda, right? Separate from among the assembly. Ve'atya eda eda. And this word eda appears elsewhere in the Torah as well. Where else does eda appear? Dichtiv ad matai la'eda hara'ah hazot. It says in our parsha with the Meraglim, ad matai la'eda hara'ah hazot. How long will this, shall I bear with this evil congregation? Okay, so we have, it's a two-step connection. Number one, we have to build the parallel of toch, because betoch b'nei Yisrael, right? Something that requires a minyan is defined by betoch, and betoch brings us to the story of Korach, and from Korach we get an allusion to the Meraglim, to the spies. How do we know that the Meraglim refers to 10? How does the spy story give us 10?
Well, there were 12.
There were 12 spies, right? So how do we get 10?
Caleb and Joshua were not evil.
Okay, so there were 10 bad spies. There were 12 total spies and 10 bad spies. So Hibadlu mitoch ha'eda hara'ah, separate from the evil assembly. The evil assembly is 10. So that's how we know that a minyan is 10.
Wow.
Okay? That's what the Gemara tells us. What does everyone think of that connection?
Bewildering, I'd say.
A little bewildering. You're not the only ones who think that. Go down to source number 5, the Rabbeinu Bachaya. I think we can do it all on one page. Nope. One line on the previous page. Okay, so Rabbeinu Bachaya is commenting on the first pasuk in this whole litany of pasukim we have to create this halachic construct. This is the pasuk in Vayikra. V'nikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael. Will be sanctified among the children of Israel. So about halfway down source number 5 in the English, it begins. It says furthermore on the last word on the line. Furthermore, do you see that if I highlight it? Yeah. No. Okay. Well, you'll figure it out. Okay. So he says. So the rabbis prove or use this pasuk that every matter of sanctity, everything that requires a minyan, requires a minimum of 10. Okay, so he goes through the halachic gymnastics that we've just outlined. Pirush Rabbeinu Yaakov. So now he quotes Rabbeinu Yaakov. I believe that's one of the Balei Tosfot. She'ein nuscha zu medukdeket. She'ein lahavi ra'aya me'asara meraglim ladavar shebikdusha. Says, how could it be that our source for a minyan comes from the Meraglim, from these evil people who were condemned to death, who were punished horribly, and who were the cause of us having to spend an extra 40 years wandering in the desert? It doesn't make any sense. So rather, he gives an alternative explanation, an alternative source for deriving a minyan. Toch, he agrees that it's built on this word toch that we have in Ikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. But he says that the toch we should be looking at isn't further on in the Torah in Sefer Bamidbar, but is earlier in Sefer Breshit. Tifatam lishpor b'toch haba'im. So go down to source number 6. This is the story of the brothers in Egypt. Vayerdu achei Yosef asara lishpor bar b'mitzrayim. So the 10 brothers of Joseph went down to gather rations to get food in Egypt, right? As the famine is, this is before they discover that this Egyptian viceroy is in fact Yosef, but as the famine is ravaging Eretz Canaan, they go to get food. Ve'et Binyamin achi Yosef lo shalach Yaakov et achav. So Benjamin was not sent with the other brothers. Ki amar pen yikra'enu ason. But he was afraid that something bad might happen to him. Vayavo b'nei Yisrael lishbor b'toch haba'im. And the children of the sons of Israel were among those who came to procure rations. Ki hayarav be'eretz Canaan, because there was a famine in the land of Canaan. So that same word b'toch appears in the context, right? It says B'nai Yisrael, which is really nice, but it's not B'nai Yisrael as we think of it, the Jewish people, but literally the sons of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
The 10 children of Israel also have this word toch associated with them, and it's 10 of them. So Rabbeinu B'chaye, and it's actually the Yushalmi in source number 8 suggests the same thing, that the source is this pasuk in Breshit rather than moving forward to Korach and then the Meraglim.
Wow.
Okay, so which explanation do you prefer? Do you prefer it being the Meraglim, or do we prefer it being the sons of Yaakov coming down to Egypt?
Whoa. That's a tough one.
It's a loaded question, right?
Yeah, really.
So we should point out that at this point in the story of Breshit, the brothers are not so good. Meaning, ultimately, there's redemption, but at this point, they're hiding what they did from their father Yaakov. They plotted against Yosef. As far as they know, they were responsible for his death, his disappearance. So they're not, they're not exactly tzaddikim here, but at least they're not at the level of Meraglim or of Korah, we could say. Just before we move on with any other sources, I think that this might, this tension actually might highlight something very important as we think about davening in a minyan and our and what it means to be in a minyan, right? Is we talk about the Meraglim as being, right? That is the normative source. It's what the Bavli quotes. It's what our Talmud quotes as being the source of the minyan. And so it really highlights the power of what a minyan can do, right? Think about the story of the Meraglim. Yes, these were important people. They were leaders of their tribes. But at the end of the day, these were 10 people among a nation of, depending how we count and who we count, right? But among a nation of 700,000, 1 million, 1.2 million, 10 people influenced the fate of an entire nation, right? An entire generation of Jews were not allowed to enter Eretz Yisrael because they listened to these 10. And so this might, it might be a really good source for minyan, because minyan, right, it tells us the power of what a minyan can do. Hopefully when we daven with a minyan, it's for the good, that our prayer experience should be to make a change for the good in the world. But it highlights to us, right, coming together with a minimum quorum, right, which we're being told is defined as 10, has really literally the power to change the world, to affect an entire generation, to affect the entire course of history. So that might be, it might be that there is a very important message in learning from the negative story, the negative example of the spies.
Wow.
That's just something to point out before we move any further. So now let's move a little bit further. When it comes to minyan, there's halachically interesting discussion around this idea of a minyan being comprised of bad people, of what we would define to be religiously bad influences, bad people, bad examples. So the Shulchan Aruch tells us in number 9, Avaryan she'avar al gzeirat hatzibor, o she'avar az avera, im lo niduhu nimne leminyan asara. a transgressor, someone who sins, what does it mean to sin? It means either to transgress a public decree, right? Meaning that
Hello?
Somebody needs to mute himself.
okay. It means either that you go against a policy that was enacted by the community, or you transgress against violate one of the mitzvot in the Torah. Right? So he says, so long as you are not excommunicated, meaning you did something bad, but so long as it didn't lead to an excommunication and being officially called out by the community for this transgression, then you can still be counted for a minyan. Okay, so we're bringing a lot of interesting and important, relevant, contemporary applications of these ideas. So we do find that there are communities that do enact various takanot, various excommunications against including people in a minyan. I think the most recently we've seen that when it comes to the whole situation of agunot, of women who are bound to marriages where their husband refuses to give a get. So if, right, there are right now instances where get refusers, husbands who refuse to give a get to their wife, are not allowed to be counted in a minyan in various shuls, and not allowed to get an aliyah to the Torah. Right, many point out that in pre-modern times, the threat of cherem, of excommunication, was much stronger than it is nowadays. Because nowadays, if someone is put into cherem in one shul, they can go down the street, they can go to a different town. No one really knows about it. We have much more mobility than Jews had in generations previous, so that the threat and the authority that any one community has is much more diminished than it used to be when there was one centralized governing body among the Jewish people. But that so long as this person was not put into cherem, as long as they weren't excommunicated or made an official decree made against them, even if they commit horrific sins, they can be included in a minyan. Right? We see similar discussions in the contemporary times about whether someone who's found guilty of abuse, of abuse of one kind or another, child abuse, sexual abuse. Maybe those are also people that should not be included in a minyan, and various efforts are put forth to exclude such people from the community. So, but so long as it doesn't come to that point, the Shulchan Aruch rules that we can count transgressors in a minyan. So an interesting halachic development is brought by the Mishnah Brura, who's quoting earlier sources, in number 10. And the Mishnah Brura says, quoting the Pri Megadim, who's one of the preeminent commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, Katafa Pri Megadim, Dafka Avera Sha'avar L'tei Avon. Aval Lahachis Afilu B'davar Echad, O Shehu Mumar La'avodat Bililim, O L'chalo Shabbos B'farhesya, Dino Ke'akum Ve'eno Mitzarif. So the Pri Megadim says that when the Shulchan Aruch rules that we can include transgressors in the minyan, it's specifically if the transgression comes from lack of will. What does it mean with avon? That their transgression is out of their appetite or their desires. Right? Meaning, they don't deny the fact that we have to follow the laws of kashrus, but what can you do? That cheeseburger from McDonald's just smells so good, I gave in to temptation. Right? And we can think of all sorts of other situations where someone can recognize what they're doing is wrong, but the temptation is too great. So if the transgression results from temptation, then they're still in, says the Pri Megadim and the Mishnah Brura. But if it is a principled transgression, I think that this rule is silly, I disagree with this specific halacha, then they're out. That's what the Mishnah Brura says in the name of the Pri Megadim. Right? So if it's lahachis, if it's to provoke, to anger as an act of intentional rebellion, then then the person is not included. Or he says there are certain cardinal sins that would rule a person out, even if they don't make the principled statement. And that would be idolatry, right? Idolatry seems in the very act to be a principled statement of denial of God in the Torah. Or the other example is L'chalel Shabbat b'farhesya, to publicly desecrate the Shabbos. Why is publicly desecrating Shabbos considered one of these point of no return for the Pri Megadim?
Because keeping Shabbos is equivalent to keeping all of the Torah?
Okay, so we do have statements that Shabbos is equated to all the Torah. We have other mitzvot that are also equated to all the Torah in various sources.
That's true.
But why? So, what's special about Shabbos in this regard?
One of the 10 Commandments.
Uh-huh.
Right, but it's the only of the 10, or there's only 2 of the 10 Commandments. Why aren't all 10 of them listed? So there's.
Because,
Go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. I was just thinking that the celebration of Shabbos, the keeping of Shabbos, is something that hopefully a whole group of people are doing together at once, but that happens with Yom Tov too, I guess.
Right. So
Well, Shabbos is an affirmation that God created the world.
okay, so we just touched on the 2 most common explanations. Number 1 is what Anne said, is that Shabbos is taken as a communal norm. So if you're Mechal Shabbos b'farhesya, right, the key being in public, so then you're showing that you are not concerned with keeping with the communal norms. If that's the case, we might think that maybe it can be expanded, right? Kashrus might also fall into that, right? But certainly Shabbos is seen as a communal norm, something that by publicly desecrating Shabbos, you're showing that I have no interest in joining together with the Jewish people in doing what they do. That's one common explanation. The other is what Gary alluded to, that we say in Kiddush every week, we say it in our davening, what is Shabbos? Right, that it is a covenant and a testimony of God's creating the world. Right, Shabbos, denying Shabbos is denying God as creator of the world. And so Shabbos is a theological affirmation that we recognize God and God's role in creation, and therefore our responsibility and obligation towards God and towards God's Torah. So those are the 2 most common explanations for why Shabbos is kind of a litmus test as to whether one is in or out. Right in the Gemara has a very powerful statement. It says that Machal Shabbos Farhesya Dino Ke'akum. Someone who publicly desecrates Shabbos, Dino Ke'akum, has the status of a non-Jew. Doesn't mean that that person is a non-Jew, but means when it comes to issues like counting in a minyan, like ne'emanus, like trusting someone to serve as a witness, like trusting someone to act as a shochet, that if they publicly desecrate Shabbos, so that might be what the litmus test is for them to be considered acceptable or not acceptable for communal norms.
It refers specifically to akum.
Right. So akum is an abbreviation for ove kochav v'mumazalot, literally an idolater. And it's a good question whether it's specifically an idolater or if that is a way of indicating a non-Jew. Most understand it's to indicate a non-Jew, and that there was, out of concern of censorship, out of concern of retribution of what the non-Jewish world might do, that rather than say nochri, rather than say non-Jew, and nochri became equivalent, a parallel to Christian, that many sources that originally said nochri were changed to say akum, to say an idolater, so as to not offend any Christian censors who are going through and looking for material with which to persecute the Jews. It's a good point, Martha. It's a very good technical read, but anytime we have any phrase in halachic literature of nachri, akum, oved avodah zara, right? Anything indicating idolater or non-Jew, we have to be aware of that history of textual editing that took place And to find what the original source was is perhaps impossible to do.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
in the history of Jewish Baltimore, do you know what was done with respect to the people who, say, denied to the extent of having Shabbos on Sunday, and whether they were allowed to be part of a minyan, say, for one of their children's bris?
So you're asking a very loaded, interesting, important question. We're going to get to in a second. There's two stages to the question, Arthur. The first is, those who, well, you're asking a more historically accurate, right? Because the original reform movement wasn't about, driving on or not keeping the halachic Shabbos. Was actually about moving Shabbos to Sunday to be more in line with the Christians. But the whole question that you're asking is really important. We're going to get there in a second, okay? We're going to get there. I have one other, let's go there first, okay? So we'll skip ahead to source number 15. And the question Arthur is asking is really, does this hold true nowadays, right? Now, we have a prevalence of Reform Jews, right? Even more prevalent than Reform Jews is unaffiliated Jews. All right, I'm sure we've all read articles about the latest Pew study and how the most common form of identification is now Jews without religion. The majority of Jews in America identify as Jews, but not with no religion, not defining what it means to be Jewish. So in a postmodern world, in a world with a reform movement, do these rules still hold true? And the first to really grapple with this question was Rav Yaakov Ettlinger. Rav Yaakov Ettlinger was a rabbi in Germany during the time of the original Reformation, but he was recognized as one of, if not the Gedolei Hador. He was the preeminent posek for all of certainly Ashkenazic Jewry, not limited to Germany, right? He got questions, he answered questions from all over the world, from Poland, from Russia, from elsewhere in Europe. So he was quite an important figure in the history of halacha. And so he has this. I didn't give the Hebrew, it was just taking up too much space on the pages. But at the end of he has a section in his responsa, Minyan Sion, where he says, as you can see here, rulings that are not for practical application. Okay, so this is his theoretical musings and ponderings. And he's dealing with it not in the context of counting for a minyan, but in the context of stam yena. Right? We know the halacha that wine handled by a non-Jew renders it unkosher, or non-mevushal wine, or non-mevushal wine handled by a non-Jew. So the question that he's pondering is, someone who affiliates with the reform movement, if they handle any wine, does that render the wine non-kosher? Or is there some other way we might think about it? So without going through the entire history, he says, the essence of the law, the Ikar Hadin, I'm in the bolded paragraph, the essence of the law is that we should see these people as being, as rendering the wine non-kosher, because they're, by denying Shabbos, by being part of the reform movement, they cross the litmus test of what halacha has defined as who is in and who is out. However, I do not know how to evaluate contemporary Jewish sinners on account that through our great sin, he quotes a Talmudic phrase, the blemish has spread to the majority. They consider Shabbos violation to be as if it is permissible, right? That these people, they're so detached from halachic Judaism, from traditional Judaism, that what they're doing, they think is the correct thing to do. Perhaps they have the status of Omer Mutter. That's the status in Gemara of someone who thinks a prohibited activity is in fact permitted, who are only close to intentional violation and not full-blown intentional sinners. There are some of these people, right, who say all of the Shabbos prayers and make Kiddush. What do we say in Kiddush? We say Kiddush as a testimony that God created the world.
Mm.
And yet their actions seem to deny that. So we have their words versus their actions. So which one should we judge them on? And then, so they say Kiddush, and then they go out and desecrate Shabbos with Torah and rabbinic violations. The reason why a Shabbos violator is considered to be non-Jewish is because, separate from his rejection of Shabbos, he denies the creation and the Creator. Contemporary Shabbos violators acknowledge God through their prayers and Kiddush. So he's not sure how to deal with them. Now jumping down to the final paragraph here. Therefore, in my own humble opinion, one who is strict and considers the wine of these sinners to be forbidden is worthy of blessing. However, those who are lenient have what to rely on, except for cases where it is clear to us that the individual knows the rules of Shabbos and is brazenly violating it in public in front of 10 Jews. Such a person is certainly a heretic and his wine is forbidden. Many understand this to mean that a Reform rabbi we could not include, but we would have to invalidate wine handled by a Reform rabbi, right? Someone who's leading the rebellion. But a regular congregant wouldn't be problematic for Rabbi Ettlinger. And elsewhere in this tshuva, you can look at it, he says, certainly when it comes to the second generation, right? A child who's raised in a Reformed synagogue doesn't know any better. Certainly we can and should be lenient perhaps in that situation, right? Those who started the rebellion, who started the Reformation, they have to be dealt with in their own way. But the second generation, the third generation, the fourth generation, we can certainly be more lenient with them. But again, he's just beginning to struggle with this, and he says that this is a theoretical, not for practical application.
Rabbi?
If you want, yes.
Rabbi Shafran once, maybe twice, castigated all conservative rabbis, but not the congregants.
Right.
Never
right.
injected anything against the congregation.
Right. This was a very common, especially in the 1950s, 1960s, with the rise of the conservative movements, that there was that distinction was made between the leadership and the laity. That the leadership knew what they were doing, were making conscious decisions, and the congregants were just kind of following what they thought was the right thing to do. They didn't know any better, and therefore couldn't be held responsible.
But he also said that if one of them came to learn with him, that if they sincerely said that if they come to a position where the other person, that Rabbi Shafran's sources and so on convince them of a change, that they need to be open to change in order to learn with him.
Okay.
So he was willing to learn with one of those rabbis if they wished, but if they were not truly open to any change at all at the very beginning, then he really felt that he should not learn with them.
Right.
But
right.
but that was not something, of course, to be made known to the public. But but he was really he was rarely really concerned about these matters, but that really got his goat.
Yeah. So with Rabbi Ettlinger, first of all, he sort of paves the way to think of a more lenient way of dealing with this contemporary situation that we have. But when he introduces the concept of the children, right, he says that the children should be treated differently, that gives rise to a halachic concept and term that is often quoted when it comes to relationships with non-Orthodox Jews and often in the world of Kiruv, and that's the concept of tinok shenishba.
Yeah.
So what's tinok shenishba? What is that concept?
They are children who don't know any better. They haven't really been educated properly.
Right. So literally, it's a case discussed in the Talmud. Tinok is a baby, Shenishba, who was taken captive. So if a Jewish baby was taken captive as a baby by non-Jews and raised as a non-Jew, so then that child is not held responsible for not knowing what Torah says and not following halacha. Literally, it's a child who was taken captive. So the concept, this idea of Tinok Shenishba, is often applied in giving justification to interacting, dealing, including non-Orthodox Jews in various aspects of Orthodox life, because they don't know any better, right? Whether they were raised, right, in the Talmud case, by idolaters, by non-Jews, or whether they were raised by uneducated, misinformed, improperly led Jewish people, it's the same category as how many poskim treat it. Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, who was a student of Rabbi Ettlinger, and who has, he's a prolific posek as well as wrote important commentary on the Chumash, on the Bible. He takes it in a slightly different direction, and here he's dealing with a live case, not a theoretical case. But right, I think I've scrolled down too far. We're not going to see the whole thing, but he says in our Minyan, there were a few people who desecrate Shabbos in public, not only by going to work, but also they smoke tobacco. What's the difference between someone who violates Shabbos by going to work and someone who smokes tobacco on Shabbos?
Well, the one who goes to work, oh boy, he's presumably not under the influence of an addiction, whereas the person who...
Oh, so you're taking it the opposite way. I like that. So Anne is saying maybe we should be more sympathetic to the one who smokes tobacco, because what we know about tobacco addiction, really nicotine addiction, but smoking, right? Maybe they can't help it. Right? So he's making the same distinction, but taking it the opposite way.
Oh, okay.
Someone who goes to work is seen as being honest, is seen as not having a choice, right? This was very, very, very common. That Jews who
that's why so many people didn't practice.
In order to keep their job, in order to have a livelihood, they couldn't not show up on Shabbos, right? So so it's seen as not being something they had a choice over, right? And we've all heard of shuls where they had the early Hashkama, the original Hashkama minyan was to enable those Jews who had to go to work to be able to daven Shabbos first. But Rabbi Hoffman's estimation, someone who smokes on Shabbos has no good explanation other than that they're denying Shabbos. Right? Anne is taking it the opposite way and saying that maybe someone who smokes just can't give in, can't control their cravings, and is so badly addicted, whereas someone who goes to work, we think of there being a bit more, flexibility in one's work schedule. But the distinction is whether it's right that mumar lahachis or mumar l'te'avon, whether it's a transgression out of weak willness or whether it's a principled transgression. That's why he introduces it that way. He goes on to say that if we're going to give a technical letter of the straight to the book analysis of this, then certainly we cannot include these people in a minyan. We have to be sure that the minyan is comprised of 10 Shomer Shabbos individuals. Presumably, he would say you can't call them up to the Torah. Certainly, they can't serve as a chazan if we're going to be technical. But he says maybe the category has changed because we said, right, what is the reason why Chilul Shabbos is the litmus test? Is because Chilul Shabbos comprises a principled separation from the Jewish people, right? It's no longer identifying, it's separate, it's not following communal norms. But he says in our days, and we'll read this one paragraph, I think it's the final paragraph. The final paragraph of this tshuva from Rabbi Hoffman. Another reason to be lenient is that in our time, we do not call them Sabbath desecrators in public, since the majority of them do it. How can you say that? They're separating from the Jewish people when they're doing what most Jews do. Most Jews drive on Shabbos. Most Jews go to the mall. Shabbos is a day of going and doing stuff. It is only the minority of Jews that go to shul and don't turn on the lights and don't cook fresh food, right? The Orthodox Jews, the Frum Jews, are in the minority. And so we can't say that they're separating from the communal norms when the overwhelming majority of the community is not keeping Shabbos in a way that Halacha says we have to. I would have granted if the majority of Jews were meritorious and only a minority were brazen to do this prohibition, they would be denying the Torah and doing an egregious sin and separating themselves from the Jewish people. But since, to our great dismay, the majority breached the fence, their solution is their corruption itself. The individual Jew thinks it's not such a terrible sin. He doesn't have to do so in privacy. There's no shame in driving and being out and about on Shabbos. So his acting in public should be halachically categorized as private. And so he changes our definition of Mechal Shabbos B'Parhesia. Someone could be in the middle of Times Square talking on their cell phone, smoking a cigarette, doing whatever violation of Shabbos they're doing, and it's not considered public desecration because they don't see themselves as conscious and deliberately separating from the norms of the Jewish community.
But that wouldn't be true for someone within an Orthodox community.
Right. So the interesting questions that contemporary rabbis wrestle with, right, gets played out. What about someone who grew up Orthodox, was raised Orthodox, and is now off the derech? Maybe such a person who's had a real Shabbos, real halachic upbringing, should still be considered as separating from the norms of halacha and therefore not included. Majority say that no, because there's, we're living in a culture where there's such a strong pressure against religious observance that maybe we even can't hold such people responsible. Right? A more extreme way that this question gets posed is, what about someone who grows up totally without any connection to Judaism, right? Happens to have a Jewish mother, maybe a Jewish father also, but someone grows up in rural Indiana or wherever. And then, they take a junior year abroad, they go to Israel, or they're touring through Europe, and, someone invites a Chabad Shaliach, somewhere invites them to come to Shabbos dinner. So now they know what Shabbos is, right? They've tasted kugel, they've seen what a religious family does. Maybe now they should be held responsible. And again, most say that just that minimal exposure certainly would not be able to undo the strong cultural influences in which they grew up. But it is really interesting, important halachic discussions that take place, right? One of the most common, certainly when it comes to someone shows up in shul, you have to question how they got there, what their level of observance and knowledge is. Can you invite someone that you know is not observant to come to your house to Shabbos, right? This is a classic question in the world of Kiruv. Is it better to give exposure even if your invitation is going to directly lead them to violate Shabbos in the short term? Do we say, well, maybe we'll spark we'll ignite the light and inspire them to want to learn more? Or the reality is most people that get some exposure doesn't really do much for them. So these are really important questions that are still lively debated, and hotly contested in the world of halacha nowadays. I'll just end. We won't do all the sources, but if we go back to source number 11. It's very interesting that after our discussion from the Shulchan Aruch, or looking at Rabbi Ettlinger, or looking at David Tzvi Hoffman, right? How do we begin Yom Kippur? Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur. How do we begin? Al Datz Hamakom the Al Datz Akal V'Yeshiva Shamal V'Yeshiva Shamata Anu Matirim Lihitpalel Im Ha'avaryanim. With the consent of the Almighty, the consent of this congregation, and convocation of heavenly court, and convocation of the lower court, we hereby grant permission to pray with transgressors. Right. So on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, right, we are inviting the Avaryanim, the transgressors, those who might be beyond the technical halachic limit of what who can and cannot be included in our minyan. We recognize that we're davening with this group. We invite them to daven with us, right? And Yom Kippur, we might say it's perhaps an admission that we're all transgressors. And so, right, we certainly can't be religious police on Yom Kippur. If we can't be religious police on Yom Kippur, we shouldn't be religious police the rest of the year. That is certainly the approach that resonates with me. As we've seen, it's one that David Tzvi Hoffman and Rabbi Etlinger paved the way for numerous contemporary poskim to base on their original chuvot to create halachic arguments to allow for a more inclusive communal standard and approach, and one which I think is the correct approach in our day and age. Many have different understandings and different applications, think that perhaps in an era of rampant transgression, we need to be more, set the walls higher and more secure, and be clear on what our communal standards are. That's it's a legitimate approach. Also, it's an approach that much of the Jewish world, of the Orthodox world, has taken. But I don't think it's one that works for me. I don't think it's one that works for our segments of the Orthodox world, and I think the approach of inclusivity is a healthier one to be taken. But anyway, it's fascinating to think that this all begins right from our parsha, and right the Meraglim, interestingly and ironically and unexpectedly, being the source of a minyan being comprised of 10. We would hope, I think, that a minyan should have its source in a better story, a more positive story, right? That we would want to have a better starting point and example, and that's not the way that the Gemara takes it. Even though, as Yerushalmi showed us, there is at least an alternative in the from Sefer Breshit. There are other ways we could have gotten to 10, but the way that the normative halachic literature takes it is that our source is the Meraglim, inspired by Korach. Right, two of the worst transgressing stories that we have in the Torah is, in fact, our source for a minyan being comprised of 10, and everything that follows from there. Any final questions or thoughts on this?
Yes, I had a couple of them. One is the reason that the Tachanun is in the daily Shachris is because of the reference in Yom Kippur? Or is it because, was it put in there because of Parshas Shelach?
I've not heard of either of those being the source for Tachanun. Right, the Gemara tells us, or the rabbis say, that we're supposed to, it's these different modes of approaching God. So we have the Amidah, which is standing before God and asking, and then we have Techina, which is literally, right, how we begin Tachanun, by putting our head down in shame and asking for mercy. Techina is a different mode of prayer that follows from the Amidah as a different way of supplicating God. And within Tachanun, we take 3 different postures in standing before God. So I'm not sure of if there's any source in the Meraglim that would lead directly to Tachanun.
Okay.
Well, what we skipped over is a Dvar Torah I've given in Shul before. You can look it up if you're so interested, or try to put it together. But the story of Bilam, right? When we enter Shul, it always bothered me that we begin, right? What do we say when we walk into Shul? Matovu.
Yeah, I totally. Yeah.
We say the words of Bilam. We say the words of this person who wanted to curse the Jewish people. How does that make any sense? So one suggestion that I made is that maybe it's showing when we begin the prayer, right, not to the same extent, but symbolically, we enter into shul, we begin approaching God, we begin our prayer as sinners, as Rishayim, almost on the level of Bilam. And through the process of prayer, through the process of beginning and right then thinking of all the other biblical verses and stories that we referenced over the course of davening, we go through a transformative experience where we began as Rishayim like Bilam, and we end hopefully in a better, higher, more pure place. So that might be, that might tie into this as well.
Second question has to do with the statement that they are from Parsha Shelach, that this evil community, Ra. Now isn't that in the mouth of Moshe Rabbeinu when he's kind of overwhelmed with what's going on? Where could you?
So if it's on source number 4 in the sheet, it's actually Hashem. Hashem's uses that term. God says to Moshe and Aaron, Ad matai le'edah hara'ah hazot. Lord spoke further to Moses and Aaron, how much longer shall that wicked community keep muttering against me?
Okay. I withdraw my question. I thought it had something to do with Moshe, and if so, then I was wondering why he wasn't punished for saying such a thing. Right. But I was kind of just going in that mode. So forget that. Okay. That's another whole question.
Yeah.
All right. The other thing was that some people understand, I know certainly the Rebbe understood, that the Meraglim were, shall we say, very reluctant to make a huge cultural change. Okay. Come back to that theme again. They didn't think that the people were not ready to, and certainly not themselves, to leave from the tremendously more spiritual possibility kind of life to them in the Midbar, where they didn't have to scramble so much to make a living and do all the other things involved with work, say agricultural work, okay, and all of these. Yeah, there are a lot of wonderful mitzvahs, but whoa, where are you going to get the time to even think about God if you have to do this kind of point of view? They didn't want to give up their own positions within the community themselves, which was based upon a different culture, and they were going to have to make their culture. But I was just thinking how wise it is to have a minyan based on that, because to be in a minyan is to form a Torah culture. It is making of another culture. It's a way of breaking away from the other rest of the world around one. And so I thought that was a delicious irony.
Interesting. All right, and stay tuned. I think the Shabbos Dvar Torah this week might pick up on that very question. So hope to see everyone in shul and to further this conversation over Shabbos. Have a good night. Again, I apologize for the
Laila Tov.
apologize for the bad link.
And we invite everyone to the Kiddush to celebrate our wedding anniversary.
Oh, Mazel Tov. All right.
Yeah.
Even a better reason to see in shul on Shabbos.
I don't know.
Okay. Have a good night.
Good night.